you're new to the channel, welcome. Happy to have you. So yesterday we watched me rough grind a bunch of these Eagles. Today I'm going to be grinding Hawks. I've got a dozen of these. They've been surface ground to 120 grit. That's as far as I go before I do the rough grinding, and that's what we're going to do. These are Nitro V. Yesterday's run of grinding was ADCR-V2. Unheat treated ADCR-V2 at that. I have four of these right now that are completely done. And then I have a dozen more in the oven right now. So 6 of them are on round 2, their final round, and 6 of them are on round 1. But that leaves me with only 2 more Eagles to grind and heat treat. One of them is for the video. Let's get started on grinding some Hawks here. And I'll just put you right up close to me. And we're going to run it. We're not going to get too hot, though, because these guys are heat treated, but all the same, hot and fast. There you go. There you go. I do need a sign. I have a sign, but it's too big. I can't put it up. I need a sign like right here, huh? Oh, I stacked this thing up way too much. Cannot move it smoothly. There you go. There's one. Nice and straight. All right. Since we got some folks in here now, let's restart. What's up, everybody? Hope you're all having a fantastic day. I'm Jacob with Very Good Knife Company. If you're new to the channel, welcome in. Happy to have you. Today I'm doing some rough grinding on these Hawks. These are Nitro V heat-treated Hawks. These knives are going to be dropping April 25th, next Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on our website, verygoodknifeco.com. I am in the 36 grit phase of these right now. I'm just getting them roughed in, and that is where this is. They look pretty good right now. This one does. It's the only one I've got done. If you enjoy this content, do subscribe and hit that thumbs up for me. It really helps us out. I'm going to be doing more of these, but first I'm going to grab myself some gloves to keep myself from getting shredded, because I've got a lot to do. Now, if you are a returning watcher, a regular here, then you know that I almost never wear gloves. But I have so much grinding to do this week. If I don't try and keep myself from getting shredded now, I'm going to be super sore, and I don't want to do that. I got 30 knives to do by next Friday. All right, let's get into another one of these. We're just going to keep on grinding here. There's one. We're going to take it from looking like this. This. There's the last one. Got some junk on this side from that pusher. Let's see. There we go. What's up, Tim School of Fish? How you doing, brother? How's it going, John? So, these are Nitro V Hawks. And if you stayed through all three of those, you saw how badly that belt degraded. By that third one, it took me about twice as long to do than it did the first one. Now, obviously, the belt's gonna wear, but it just goes to show how much it wears with hardened steel versus unhardened steel. Because yesterday, if you were watching, I would grind 4 of these, 4 whole big giant grinds on this soft unheat treated 80 CRV2 to one belt. And now I'm only getting 3 of these to one belt. The same belt at the same speed. So that's a big contributing factor to the price difference in 80 CRV2 versus Nitro V. Nitro V is usually about 50 to 60 bucks more expensive. On some of the bigger knives, it's going to be more like $100 more expensive, because some of the really big knives, like the Huntsman, or if I was to do the Eagle in Nitro V, yeah, you're going to be paying for 3 36 grit belts and 3 60 grit belts and all the other stuff to get it done. So I'm going to swap to a new belt. And every one of those belts, these belts right here, 11 bucks. No big deal. Just have to keep that in mind when you're selling, because this Nitro V will absolutely destroy them. But you can't heat treat them when they're ground. They'll warp. You won't get the same kind of... Ooh, that backing plate's hot. Alright, so, as I was saying, you can't heat treat them when they're in this stage. The reason why, you see those aluminum plates right there? These right here get wrapped in. What's up, Gabe? How you doing? We were just talking about you. As always, right here, brother. This is your design. This is Gabriel's design, the Hawk, and this also is Gabriel's design, the Eagle. All these knives are dropping April 25th, next Friday. So, as I was saying, the Nitro V has to be plate quenched in those aluminum plates, and the flatter the better. So if it's not flat against the plates, then we won't get the same kind of quench out towards the edge. I would rather just have it all even. Do it that way. On your way to work to make some guns. That's awesome. Gabe works at a gun factory. Pretty sweet. Alrighty. We've got us a new belt. Another 36 grit ceramic. We're going to run it again. 2 belts down. Oh, what's up, everybody? If you're new in here, I'm Jacob with Very Good Knife Company. Hope you're all having a fantastic day. You've stumbled into me having a grinding session. Now I got mask lines all over my face, and I look like a goofball. I do anyway, with or without the mask lines, so what the hell. This is a Hawk and Nitro V, just like all the rest of these now are all 36 grit ground. So, again, if you were watching all those, you could definitely see that belt wear out and how that last one took a lot more time than the first one. 3-2 a belt, that's what we're running here for hardened Nitro V. That's just the way it is. I'm gonna swap the belt and run another 3. So I've got 6 more to do, so 2 more belts still to go. This is my task for the day, for the end of the day. Yesterday, if any of you guys were in here, you saw me grind Eagles. Now, I know some of you are thinking you already said that. Yes. People come in and out, so I got to re-update. I've shredded a glove. It'll last 3 more. I saw somebody say something about nitrile gloves. Yeah, these are just nitrile gloves. Thin, cheap junk nitrile gloves. I really don't usually ever wear gloves. You guys that have been in here a good bit know that I almost never wear gloves. But I have so many blades to grind this week. If I don't try and at least keep some of my skin, then I'm going to be not in good shape by the end of the week. I've got 30 blades that have to be finished ground this week. Period. End of story. Or else there's no way I'm going to get them all finished by next Friday for the drop. So that includes 18 of these big old Eagles and a dozen of its smaller brother, the Hawk. It is a heck of a drop, buddy. It's going to be a heck of a drop. It is quite a lot, though. Indeed. I'm going to go swap this glove out. See, I've got pretty calloused hands and fingers already. I usually do all of this without any gloves, and it just doesn't bother. But finishing the race is more important this week. Oh, my hand's all moist and tacky now. So, who all we got in here? Let me take a look. The missus made it home. Sacrificial skin is 110%. Exactly what I'm using them for today. If I use gloves at all, ever, then it's nitrile. And like I said, the only reason I use gloves is to try and save a little bit of skin. But I like to be able to feel these. Now, all these blades are heat treated, so I can't burn them. You'll start burning yourself at about 200 degrees. But as long as we don't go over 350, then we're good. And usually you don't hit 350 until you start seeing a little light straw color, like a brownish color. And we're okay on all of these. You can see they're all blue still. But I can't feel that if I've got super thick gloves on or if I'm not holding it. So it's worth burning myself to make sure that I don't burn the blades. Because I can regrow some skin on my fingies. Here we go. is number 9. Knife number 9, not belt number 9. All right, so looks like we've stated a pretty constant number. But if you're new in here, I'm Jacob with Very Good Knife Company. Good to see you. You've stumbled into me doing a grinding session, and today we're flat grinding Hawks. These are all Nitro-V, and they are heat treated. They're hard, which is why I'm only getting 3 to a belt. And I've got 3 left. That's it. Out of the whole stack. Not bad. I've almost hit my mark. So, I was really, really hopeful that I could get 4 to a belt. I don't know. I just haven't done any big grinding of Nitro-V in a minute. So, I should have known better. But I only brought 3 belts. So, I'm going to go grab another belt. And I just bought belts. And I'm almost out of the 36 grit again. This is funny. Check this out. It would look super cool, I think. Although it might not be, well, it would be plenty slicey enough. I could make it super slicey. That grind would probably come up to about there. It would be the same stock as the Tradition, the full-size Tradition, and it's hollow ground. It would just have a lot of cheek. It would look closer in terms of the grind to ricasso ratio as the Eagle. It would look closer to that, whereas they are now full flat grind. No cheek. Not much ricasso. Holy cow, that backing plate is scorched. Super hot. 4 grinder has been absolutely put through the ringer. This is the new grinder, the one that I got last year at just after Blade Show. I actually ordered it the day after Blade Show, and it's paid for itself quite a bit of times over already. All right, let's see. I've got about 20 minutes until the oven goes off, and then we'll have to go get those Eagles out of the oven over there. And in that time, I should be able to finish the rest of these, and then I'll be taking off. Line 3. Let's do it. One more. What's up, Zach? Check it out. There's the last one. All right, now I can ditch the mask and the gloves for the day and have a chat with you guys for a minute. Let me spray off right quick. All right. Well, what's up, everybody? If you're new in here, I'm Jacob with Very Good Knife Company. Good to see you. Welcome to the channel. You've stumbled into me finishing up today's grinding session, but I'm not done yet. We'll talk for a second. Just hang around if you like. If you're new in here, or you're not new in here, welcome back. Good to see you. Who else we got? Irish Aggressor. That was just a few minutes ago. This is Nitro V stainless. It is a simple stainless. Manny, what's up, Manny? We've got Jeff Harmon. What's up, Jeff? Anya Montoya. Zach Schmidt. What's up, Steven? And a few others. All right. So, yesterday, if you were here, you watched me grind the Eagles. And those were not heat treated. These are ADCR V2 carbon steel. And as of today, they are heat treated. So, I've got 4 of them that have been finished. They are done with their round 2. And here in just a minute, let's go check. Let's go see. I believe we have 7 minutes left on the oven there. And when that oven is done, there will be 6 of them that are done with their round 2. So they'll be joining these 10. And that'll give me 10 finished. There's another 6 in there that have to go in for round 2 tomorrow, because I'm not staying for another 2.5 hours. So, this is what we got done today. Rough grinding Nitro V Hawks. And I'm tickled that they are finally done with, because this, holy cow. Rough grinding Nitro V is the biggest pain. Now, once they get past rough grinding and it's just finished grinding, it's not a whole lot worse than ADCR V2, but just getting all that extra material off to get the bevel close to where it's supposed to be is the pain. It took me 114 minutes to get through all that. Yesterday I did 8 Eagles in that time. Pretty much same process. Now there's 12 here, of course they're small, but I only used 2 belts yesterday, and today I used 4 for these tiny little dudes. That's just amazing to me how much the hardened Nitro V just eats it alive. It's about 62-ish and a half on the hardness, Rockwell, and you can tell. So, those 12 plus the 18 Eagles that we've got will be dropping April 25th on the website, verygoodknifeco.com. I'm sure the missus has already put that link up in here a few times today. Now, today I got the 12 that are in there heat treated. That was my job today. And on top of that, I did the facing. You can see the radius for all the handles. These are all the handles. Not all of them, but the red. I did the facing for the on the front and the back for the Eagles. And then I also did all the Hawk handles. So, you're fired. All right. So I've done all the facing for all the handles of this entire run. Now, tomorrow I will be getting started on the how it's made video for the Eagles. I've already done one for the Hawks, so I'm not going to do that over again. But I have not done one for the all right, now, children in here. I will be starting the video for the Eagle, how it's made, tomorrow. Now that everything's pretty much out of my way, the mass majority of the heavy work. Now, finish grinding is going to be an absolute chore. It's going to be a chore and a half. That is for sure. But my goal for the whole 2 weeks was at the end of this week to have every single one of the blades, all 30 of them, finished ground and ready for handles. I would even like to have them, I would go so far as to say I could have them assembled and ready to get started on Monday, which would put me finishing somewhere around Wednesday or Thursday. I'm still going to have a bunch of time in sheaths and the belt loops and all that good mess. But I did leave one piece of ADCR V2. It's not whole. This was cut from a 4-foot piece, but I left one so I could show the actual process of scribing and drilling and the boring stuff. But I did not show that on the Huntsman, and a couple people asked why I didn't show that. So I'll show it this time. No big deal. Once this run is wrapped up and out of the way, the only thing left for me to do is going to be Blade Show. I've got to get prepped for Blade Show, and that my plan with this big run was to hopefully have, you know, if everything works out, a good enough drop to tie me over and take some time off of doing drops to be able to stock up for Blade Show. Because I've got a whole bunch of blades sitting over here. This is all ADCR V2, just ADCR V2. And I wanted to have about 3 or 4 of every model. I don't have any Nitro V sitting here. So I've got to get started on the Nitro V for the Blade Show run. I set myself a goal for 100 knives. I wanted to show up with 100 knives. Will it happen? Doubtful. But if I fall short of that, it won't be by much. I'll be tickled with that. So this is cool. Check it out. This stalactite or stalagmite. Does a stalactite or stalagmite grow from the floor? Which one? This is a grinder dust stalactite or stalagmite. I believe stalagmite grows from the floor. That's cool. Oh boy. I was hoping to, oh yeah. I also today, I had to build a new table for my heat treat setup. Yesterday, I got another burner so I can heat 2 oil tanks at a time. I used to have another one, but it quit on me and I never replaced it. Today, I've made a new table for the double burner. So that is quenching oil. It's canola oil. That's what I like to use for ADCR V2. And I use the burners to heat the oil up because you can't use cold oil. It's got to be, for me, I like a minimum of 118 degrees, a maximum of about 145. Anywhere in there, the quench is close to the same. It's marginal, the difference. So I do have some signature series planned for Blade Show. I have one in particular that I want to spend some time on really getting really nice. And that is that dagger that I showed a while back. And this one is going to get some fat carbon uni copper. I got that sheet right here to show you. Fat carbon uni copper. That's pretty cool, huh? There is the Eagles. There they be. All right, guys, if you're in the Northeast Georgia area and you need the best plumbing service that ever did exist, give Sweetman's Plumbing a call, 770-538-0727. Get a sweet deal. All right. So the 6 on the right. This is it. This is all I've been waiting on to go home now. The 6 on the right here are done. Round 2 done. And the 6 on the left have got to go again. Might not have room on my rack. Alright, these guys, can't get them mixed. I'm going to go set these somewhere else. Actually, see if I can get them to stand up. Stay. This is funny. Alright, let me grab my pliers. I gotta have room on my rack here. I need another rack. Stay. Alright, there we go. Now I got enough room. Okie dokie. So, there is a dozen of those Eagles, 8 of which I ground yesterday. Now, like I said, the 6 on the left have to go one more cycle, but they've got to be completely cooled off. The whole cycle is 2 hours and 10 minutes. I'm not going to be here that much longer because it is 5:30 already, and I'm ready to take off. It has been a very, very long day. It's been a long week already, and it's only Tuesday. But the run is definitely moving along exactly how I had hoped it would. I only have 2 more of the Eagles to grind and heat treat, which is fantastic. I will have those caught up tomorrow, and tomorrow I will begin the finish grinding. That Tradition Junior and Rich Light is pretty sweet. The Rich Light was not the most fun to work with. It isn't a pain, but it's very touchy. It's really touchy because it's paper micarta. If you hit it with if you go too slow on the belt, it discolors like right away. So it just took a little bit of hastiness. Just get moving with it. You can't take your time with it. You got to just get moving. But it turned out really nice, and no worries, boss. I didn't spend too much time on it, so I will probably do some Rich Light in the future for sure, because I still have that little sheet that I got. I don't know. We'll see. Depends. I've got so many materials on my list of I want to use that, and that was one of them. I've never done anything with Rich Light. I have used paper micarta in the past, but not under the name of Rich Light. So I guess you could say it's all the same thing. This is that Rich Light that I'm speaking of. It is Redstone Rich Light, and it's similar to the Burgundy micarta, but it's not at the same time. The color's close. This has just got that glossy sheen from being cast, the resin. And this is dull, but pretty nice looking stuff when it's done. It's got a good depth of color to it, a really good depth of color. It's pretty sweet. All right, guys. So tomorrow I will be doing some live finish grinding at the end of the day once again. The AEBL kitchen knives are gone. Chad has one of them, and we have the other. And I'll show it. I'll have to do like a short video or something with it. But anyhow, I appreciate you guys joining in. Thank you for everybody who has supported me along the way. I appreciate everybody's support, no matter how big or small. Guys, if you are new to the channel, thanks for being here. Hit that subscribe button and that thumbs up. Also hit that notification bell on the channel. It'll let you know when I'm going live again, if and you're into this content. Guys, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.